Well, welcome back. I did tell you that by-elections and rerun elections will be taking place in February. And so political parties are putting their house in order to ensure they participate in that exercise to make the most of it, which is going to be a major conversation today on the program, the very first part. And then afterwards, when we go on a break and come back, we'll switch gears to preparations for the Edo governorship elections. We'll take a look at some of the permutations that are already going on in terms of the political parties and all of that. But first, let's tell you that the by-elections will be taking place in 2 senatorial districts, 3 about 4 federal constituencies and about 3 state constituencies. We'll reel out all of them as much as we can. I'm being joined on the program as we explore this issue by the Executive Director of YEGA Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo, who is joining us from our Abuja studio. Mr. Itodo, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me and Happy New Year.
I wish you the very same. And also joining us via Zoom here in Lagos, a political analyst, Mr. Sulaiman Arigbabu. Mr. Arigbabu, thank you so much for coming on the program. Mr. Arigbabu, if you can hear me. All right, well, we'll try to sort that out. Let me get straight to business with Mr. Itodo on this one. Mr. Itodo, now the by-elections and the rerun are built for February 3rd, we understand, according to INEC. So let's begin from the very basics with what is expected of aspirants who may eventually emerge as candidates. I'm asking that question because of what we see happen after elections and issues of litigation and all of that. We'll get deep into all of this. What now is expected of these aspirants? INEC has said, look, you have between 5th, I think 9th or so for you to conduct your primaries and sort out your dispute and resolve all of that so that by February 3rd, everybody heads out to the poll to decide, for the people to decide who they want to represent them in the legislative arm of government. So if you were to give a bit of a kit in terms of preparations or what is expected of them as aspirants, what would they be?
Well, thanks, Jeffrey. I think for those who have indicated interest to secure their party nomination to run in the off-cycle election have a huge task and a huge responsibility to comply with the rules. One of the biggest challenges that we have in our electoral process is this proclivity and the penchant of aspirants and political parties to not comply with their own rules in the candidate selection process. As you can see, the party primaries are due to commence shortly. And so we expect that these aspirants, will comply with the rules. But the parties would also ensure that they comply with their constitution and the guidelines, as well as provisions of the Electoral Act that regulates the conduct of primaries. What we have seen in the whole candidate selection process is this commercialization of the nomination process. And if you look at the last election, the entire process was fraught with delegates procurement. And that undermines the choice that delegates make in nominating candidates. So we hope that the candidates that will emerge are not the highest bidders and the highest spenders, or those who have been appointed and anointed by party hegemons or godfathers, but they will be people who members of the parties desire to lead the party as their standard bearers in the off-cycle election. So it is critical because this entire process, is coming against the background of the general election, against the background of the last 2 off-cycle elections. So we expect that these aspirants and the political parties will play by the rules. But if experience is one thing to defer to, we have to caution our political parties and the aspirants to comply by the rules.
I want us to dig further into what you've just raised, because there are a couple of things you touched. I want to take them in bits so that everybody will understand what exactly we're saying. What are some of the issues that occasion the rerun exercise, especially in those places where we have entire constituencies trying to get a representation in any of the houses of assembly, whether state or federal. And this will help to eventually avoid some of the things we see in terms of litigation. So what are the, I know that there was a particular exercise, I think in Imo State, that involved Ugochinyere, if I'm correct, that had to do with where the exercise took place, the venue of the exercise itself, because you mentioned it in passing, but I want us to break it down as much as possible. So if you can remember some of the peculiar cases and what eventually led to maybe election being cancelled or a rerun being declared or all of that, you can help us explore that conversation.
So I'll look at this from a legal standpoint. First, the Electoral Act is very clear that political parties are required to submit their list of candidates and their register of members to INEC 30 days before the date of an election. And so we expect that parties will comply with this, because once a list of members and list of delegates have been submitted to INEC, then these cases of delegate list substitution, won't be the case. But there's a gap in the law, and that provision is not substantial enough or exhaustive enough, because there is no sanction for that. And that's one area for reforms. Now, what happens if a party fails to submit the list of delegates as well as the register of members to INEC? Is there a consequence for failure to comply with that provision? The answer is no, based on provisions of the Electoral Act. So that's one opportunity, for reform. But parties ought to comply with that particular provision. The second is the Act is very clear as to notification to INEC. And the law says that parties are required to notify INEC of their primaries 21 days. There's a 21 days, timeline that is set. Now, once a notification has gone to INEC and the notification contains the date and the venue, then parties cannot change, the venue of their primaries overnight and without notifying the Electoral Commission. Because what we have seen are cases where parties decide to change the venues of their primaries without notifying the Electoral Commission. And the law is also clear that if INEC does not do what? If it does not monitor those primaries, then those primaries, to the extent of their existence, are null and void. Although, and this is one of the issues with the judgments issued by the Supreme Court in 2 cases prior to the elections, where it held that issues around candidates' nomination are the exclusive preserve of political parties, and INEC cannot meddle into that, those primaries. But it's actually at variance with the provisions of the Electoral Act. And the position of the law, the position of the Electoral Act, is that when it comes to the conduct of primaries, INEC ought to, by virtue of the provisions of the Act, present at those primaries. So if a party decides on its own to change the venue of a primary either a few hours before the primaries, it is inconsistent, and that location is inconsistent with the nomination, but the notification provided earlier to INEC, and INEC is not physically present at that particular primaries, then our interpretation of the law is that such a primary is actually null and void and cannot be recognized by the Electoral Commission. The other critical issue around the nomination of candidates is, yes, we've seen situations where primaries conducted by parties, either through direct or indirect primaries or consensus, fulfill the provisions of the law. But what happens is that after the primaries, there is now substitution of candidates, and we've seen parties exploit the provisions of the Act. And the law is very clear. Now, the only instances where you can substitute a candidate based on the Electoral Act is where a candidate dies or where a candidate does what? Withdraws from the race. But we've seen cases where candidates have refused or do not. We've seen cases where candidates did not voluntarily withdraw from the race, but parties have showed up either with fake death certificates, claiming that those candidates are dead because they want to ensure that they advance a political agenda or ensure that a candidate that does not enjoy popular support from the people is forced and installed as a candidate of a political party. These are some of the issues, and parties have a responsibility to comply by the rules stated in both INEC's guidelines and the Electoral Act. We cannot take excuses from parties in this upcoming by-elections because prior to the 2023 elections, the parties claimed that the act was only operational just few months after it was signed into law. Now, in the next couple of weeks, the 2022 electoral will be 2 years in existence. So no party should claim that it does not understand the guidelines and the provisions of the Electoral Act because the processes are clearly articulated in the electoral law.
All right, Mr. Sampson, I'll definitely come back to you, but I understand Mr. Arigbabu has joined us. Mr. Arigbabu, thank you so much for coming on the program. But I want to be sure you can hear me. Can you hear me, sir?
I hear you clearly. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I've been asking Mr. Itodo, which I want you to jump on, is because Nigerians are a bit weary of too many court cases or litigations related to elections. So as much as possible, one of the things we want to achieve is to educate even the players in this particular power game on how to play this. Because when he was explaining the things he was explaining, you would think that for somebody to belong to a political party and aspire to be anything, to be nominated as a candidate of his party for any position, you will at least be familiar with basics of the Constitution as relates to elections, with basics of the Electoral Act and the guidelines, with basics of your party constitution. But when you go to court and listen to the process or the proceedings of court, you begin to wonder, is it that maybe this individual did not understand what the law says? So I don't know what you make of that in helping to educate this.
Yes, thank you very much. INEC, of course, unfortunately, one cannot envy INEC's position at this time in our polity because the political parties and the political gladiators cannot be trusted to play by the book. The leadership recruitment process at the political party level is nothing near being democratic. So you have a candidate emerging not because they are the best qualified or not because they confirm with every requirement of the office, both in terms of competence and legality, but because they are the anointed candidate of some power brokers in the party. And we are going to have a lot of that in this process. Unfortunately, INEC has set the date for February 3rd, and I do not think that there will be enough time between party primaries and all the litigations and whatever that will come after it. So there's going to be a lot of litigations, no doubt, knowing that our politicians don't lose gallantly, either at the primaries level of their various parties or even at the inter-party election levels. So what you have is the fact that it is godfathers within political parties who anoint candidates. And then they tell the players to go and make that candidate compliant. And if the candidate is not compliant or ordinary prima facie not qualified, it then becomes a post-election problem for the party and, of course, for INEC and the rest of us. So we are going to see a bit of that in this rerun elections that's going to happen because we are seeing across parties now that candidates are jostling amongst themselves to get the tickets of their parties. Now, we know that power players are already deciding, either in some cases from Abuja or from the various state capitals where these by-elections and reruns will be happening. So we're already seeing things starting to unfold. And I can tell you that most of the candidates that will come out, or perhaps those that will win, because many candidates also, when they are being, because there is this thing that if you do not want to have your secret in the public, if you do not want to hear the history of yourself that you do not know, don't go into political parties. So it is high time for every person who is intending or who is putting themselves forward to contest for political office to do soul searching. If you know there are things about you that are not befitting that are not okay in the eye of the law, or that you will not want to be in the public space, then it's better not to, because politicians don't take it easy. They are going to start dig into all the secrets of anybody who is competing against them, whether the person is more competent than they are or not. A lot of this will happen. So INEC is then going to have the problem of having to deal with, okay, so some of the political parties now are going to have issues of which names do they submit to INEC, because they are going to have multiple processes putting forward multiple candidates for one political party. So our political elite, the political parties, have not evolved. They are still in the mode of business as usual, unfortunately. And this is because so far there has not been consequences for political parties and political actors who make the electioneering process difficult and cumbersome, who make us have so many litigation cases after elections because of them not playing by their own books, their party constitution, and by the constitution of the country.
Okay. Mr. Itodo, let me throw this to you from where here, because before we go to other issues that relates to this election, and maybe reel out some of the places where these elections will take place, would you say that looking at these power brokers to play by the rules is just mere wishful thinking based on what we've seen?
There's a sharp divide between idealism and realism. First, the ideal is that the political class and those who are involved in this game comply with the rules. Because first, you cannot operate a process that is not bound by rules. We are a democracy. But whilst we've got a very defective political culture where politicians are only interested in seeking power at all costs, they are not interested in upholding democratic principles and values, it becomes a problem. So the ideal is that they will comply. But the reality is the fact that you've got a mindset problem. We have an attitudinal problem. And it's the attitude towards politics. It's a zero-sum game. It's a do-or-die affair. And so people are willing to deploy all sorts of shenanigans just to secure party nomination. Why is it that our candidate selection process is determined by the highest bidder and the highest spender? Why is it that we've got situations where political parties substitute candidates unlawfully? Go and check. Even when a party primary conforms with the tenets of democratic elections, primary elections, wait between when the party submits the first list to INEC and when INEC publishes the final list, just check the amount of substitution that takes place. So we've seen those cases, and that is why, litigants have approached the courts to say, hey, we have won primary elections, but our parties have decided to do what? To substitute us unlawfully. And so this is the case that we're dealing with. But how do we get out of this? One, you need a regulatory mechanism that keeps the political parties in check. And in this case, INEC. And this is where, when we talk about unbundling INEC, we need to have a conversation on whether we want INEC to perform this responsibility. And in my sort of humble submission is that the Electoral Commission cannot and has not fulfilled that particular responsibility for several reasons, whether social, whether economic or political. And this is why, the Justice Uwe's committee recommended that we need a separate institution that will register and regulate political parties. And we hope that the House of Representatives, who have articulated in their legislative agenda to sponsor or pass a political parties bill, will keep this in view. And so this is it. But the voters, because as we have this conversation, the voters also matter, especially those who are members of political parties. And we should be interested in asking political parties and setting the agenda on the kind of candidates that political parties, do what present. So on February 3rd or before February 3rd, voters are not, presented with a fait accompli. And so it's important that voters and those who are in those constituencies in the 9 states, for the by-elections, and in those 35 constituencies put the fire before the parties and tell them, do not field candidates who one, have no respect for the rule of law, have no respect for people, have no respect for human rights, do not have the competence, the character, and the capacity to hold those public office. Because as you have now within our electoral process, even if a political party fields a criminal, we don't have a system in place that will keep that party in check. And that is a fundamental problem of our political system.
Very maybe that speaks to, I saw it while I was coming on for the show, and I was just looking at some things. I saw perhaps these are some of the build-up to the challenges we are facing. In Lagos here, I saw some groups saying, they call themselves the APC group to, what's their name now? Progressives for Surulere, P4S. And the headline says, APC group to Tinubu, we could lose Baja's Lagos constituency to greed in by-election. And they are talking about imposition of candidates. So we're already seeing things happening. But let's remind our viewers that 2 senatorial districts that's in Ebonyi State and Yobe will be having by-elections. 4 federal constituencies, 1 in Ondo, 1 in Taraba, 1 in Lagos, 1 in Kebbi will be having by-elections. State constituencies include 1 in Borno, Kaduna, and Benue State. Let me go back to Mr. Arigbabo. Let's talk about the issue of nomination forms and expression of interest forms and party pricing policy. If my producer can just give me the list according to some of the lead political parties. We're not discriminating against anybody, please, but these are the ones we could quickly get out. The APC, if you're running for Senate, 20 million naira. For the House of Representatives, 10 million naira. State Assembly, 2 million naira. PDP, we have 3.5, reps 2.5, states 600,000. And for Labour Party, Senate 3.5 million, reps 2 million, and then State House of Assembly 500,000. When you look at how these monies are being listed and how these amounts are pegged, do you see strategy here by a political party in terms of their pricing of their nomination form? We know that there are subsidies, if you will, maybe for women, for people with disability, for the young people.
Well, of course, political parties in Nigeria have always used the price tag as one of the gatekeeping mechanisms to determine who gets to what. If you look at the last presidential election, 100 million and what have you. So they have always used a price tag as the way of keeping some people out of the frame. Forget about the window dressing of saying we are giving some concession to this category of people. So price tag is a tool that they use. But beyond that, it is the money. We are talking about the official amount. We are not talking about what it is in the first place that endears that person to the gatekeepers in the constituency or the political parties. So a lot of money is spent outside of that which we know officially. So a lot of money is being used as one to determine whether you are even fit to carry the card of that party in the first place. And then money is also used officially in the open as a means of determining whether you can get the ticket of the party. And then you now come to the monies that the candidates and their supporters will need to spend in terms of reaching out to the would-be voters within parties. We are still talking at party level now. We have not come to the main elections where it is inter-party. We are talking within intra-party. And by the time you look at the check book that you need to have, the kind of war chest that you need to have to be a senator, to be a Federal House of Rep member, or to be an House of Assembly member, then you know that many people have already been excluded who are prima facie qualified, who are loved in their communities, who will not give you so much post-election litigations. So all of these kind of people have been sidelined so that people who have a war chest, people who have been able to reach out to political party gatekeepers are the ones who eventually emerge as the candidate. And this cuts across the major political parties. I personally do not blame the political parties for that because many of the political parties are business entities, unfortunately. It is until citizens are able to rise to the occasion and look at candidates that they prefer in their communities and tell the candidates, go and pick the form of even the least popular party and we will stand by you. Because it is easiest to do at the small constituency level of saying House of Rep, House of Assembly and Senate, rather than when you are looking at a whole state, the gubernatorial election or the presidential election for the entire country. But contesting for an House of Assembly seat, contesting for a federal constituency seat, these are places that are easy for citizens to show their resolve, to reject bad governance, to reject money-back politics, to say that we are going to look for a candidate that will best represent us, that is best qualified, and whether the person has money or not, we will stand by this person and get the person to the office that we desire for such person. So until citizens are able to do that, political parties will continue to open their big supermarkets during elections, where the highest bidder will come and pick their card. And of course, the highest bidder also knows how to manipulate the system to become the eventual winner of the election. So it is a matter for citizens to come to a resolution that we want to show the political class that power truly resides in our vote, that power truly resides with the people. And we are going to show that example, for instance, from this by-election. Let's Surulere, for instance, say this election is not going to go to the highest bidder. Let's Surulere, for instance, say no matter what the party is, if we see a good candidate, we will vote for that candidate irrespective of the political party. Until we're able to do that, we'll continue to suffer in the shackles of oppression that the political parties have been able, to bind all of us by.
All right. Let me come to you, Mr. Itodo. Taking it from where Mr. Sulaiman has mentioned, in the last election, we saw amounts in millions, on tens of millions, or even 100 million naira for nomination and expression of interest forms and all of that. Some have argued that this is to see that it's not an all-comers game, more like discrimination by price. He has said, and some people have also maintained that position, that this is just a way to say only people with war chests can contest election in some of these big political parties. And you can see it's not because for now the APC is ruling. When you see the PDP ruling, you can see that maybe the ruling party has the highest amount. Is this a guarantee of victory or just discrimination by price? Because a lot of people feel that if I join the big party, I will win the election. What is it for you, and how expensive is it for you? Again, it doesn't mean that elections are still expensive in Nigeria. Two questions.
Well, it's quite interesting. In our democratic journey, right, one time where we are reminded that we're gradually gravitating towards a plutocratic state is during candidates' nomination. Because it's very clear that a plutocratic state is emerging from the way our candidate nomination process is commercialized. And when parties peg this high cost of nomination fees, what they are simply saying is leadership is for the rich, by the rich, and with the rich. It's not an all-comers affair. And politicians and political leaders have said this categorically clear. We've had chairmen of leading political parties in Nigeria who have told us that, hey, they introduced this high cost of nomination fees to do what? To exclude a certain category of people. And that is problematic. The second is, money is said to be the mother's milk of politics. And what you clearly see is an expression of that money defines, politics. And it's really sad, for our political process. Yes, parties justify this high cost of nomination fee as an avenue for generating revenue to address operational issues. And the big question there is, as a country, we need to have a conversation about political finance reform as well as campaign reforms. That parties need to think about innovative ways of generating income to fund their activities and not necessarily pegging this high cost of nomination fees, because what it does, it shrinks the political space and limits the opportunities for fair competition. The second justification that we have heard, and because we've written extensively on this, is this whole notion of inflation. Because parties use inflation as a justification for pegging high cost of nomination fees. And the fundamental question is, that justification is not tenable for one reason. One, if you check inflation and then check inflation vis-a-vis the amount, because if inflation is somewhere at about 25 or 26%, and you check the cost of nomination fees in 2023 election or in 2022, then the increase shouldn't be over 200%. It should be within, the percentage of inflation. So I don't particularly agree. It's just clear that the candidate nomination process is a commercialized one, and that, the controllers of the political parties and those who manage, candidate nomination need to rethink, what defines and what should be the qualification for public leadership.
All right.
And I think it should go beyond whether you have the fiscal might to execute elections. I think that electoral fortunes for political parties should not be tied to how much a candidate earns or how much they can generate from selling nomination forms.
All right, Mr. Itodo, I'm just going to give you and Mr. Arigbabu 30 seconds each. We cannot talk about it without talking about INEC preparedness. So my question will be naturally, do you see INEC being ready for this exercise? Is INEC doing enough to redeem itself from what happened in the last election, given all they have done? Maybe 30 seconds each, because we're totally out of time. Mr. Itodo? Okay, Mr. Suleiman, you can go. Since you started, just go ahead, please. 30 seconds.
Okay, so for me, I think INEC is INEC should be ready. INEC usually, if you notice, does perform well when it comes to some of these off-cycle elections. So I expect INEC should be ready for this by-election. However, I think INEC will have quite a bit of challenges. If you look at, for instance, we are not talking about Rivers State. If we are not talking about, of course, the 25 or 26 House of Assembly members whose status is not clear, whether they are still to be declared vacant or not. But even Edison here, the former factional speaker, has voluntarily resigned and joined the executive. It means that that's also a seat that's going to be opened. It's not under what INEC is.
Okay.
So there are issues that are going to come to life for INEC, not because INEC is not prepared, but because the political class is designed to frustrate even the best system. So I do not, I do not envy INEC at all.
All right, let me come to you, Mr. Itodo. 30 seconds. Totally out of time, Mr. Itodo.
I have no doubt that INEC will be ready for the off-cycle, for the rerun and the by-elections. I have no doubt that INEC will be ready. The big question is that as you prepare for the primaries, INEC needs to remain consistent in the actions and the decisions that it takes, because this party primaries will be faced with a lot of challenges. And if INEC does not monitor those primaries, then it shouldn't, enlist candidates or publish the names of candidates based on the provisions of the Electoral Act.
I must thank you so much, Mr. Samson Itodo, the Executive Director, YAGA Africa, for coming on the program, as well as Mr. Suleiman Arigbabu, Political Analyst. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insight as we get ready for February 3rd, rerun and by-elections across different parts of the country. Thank you for coming on the program.
Much.